Hi folks, today's topic is titled Effective Open Source Maintenance, or how to keep your community's open source creators sane and productive, or what we can do as a community to help stop maintainer burnout. This talk is for you if you use open source, right? So it's directed at open source consumers. The goal is to explore what we can do to help keep creators, that is authors, maintainers, support folks, etc., happy and productive for as long as possible. All right. So this isn't meant to be altruistic. The interests of creators and consumers are very much aligned. My own background is in Clojure, open source. I've written and maintained a bunch of Clojure stuff for the last 13 years or so. But my observations and suggestions here aren't just about Clojure or the Clojure community. This discussion, I think, is largely language and community agnostic. So the goal, basically, more people creating more open source work, existing creators staying active for longer, getting more value out of our existing open source folks, and ultimately keeping everyone happy, right? I'm going to go pretty deep, so this might run long. There are broadly two sections I'm splitting this into. First is conceptual stuff, so philosophical ideas, motivations, and then practical suggestions. So basically the actionable bits. Feel free to skip to the actionable bits if that interests you. I'm going to start with some disclaimers. So first up, this talk is not meant as a rant or as a rebuke, although I am going to be deliberately including some ranting. The purpose isn't to vent, but it's to cultivate empathy, right? Not everyone has worked as an open source creator, and I want to explore some of the emotional challenges involved in doing that work, right? So the intent is let's say, to be constructive. This talk is not about me. I promise that this isn't Peter's list of grievances. It's pretty much, I'm pretty much at peace with how open source works in practice, but I also think we can often do better for little cost. Third point, I don't speak obviously for all open source creators. We have different motivations, we have different sensitivities. You may be a creator hearing what I'm saying and thinking like that's complete nonsense, that doesn't apply to me, and of course that's fine. I'm talking broad strokes and rules of thumb, right? So these aren't, what I'm going to say is not meant as proclamations. Number 4, obviously, you may already be doing what I'm talking about here, right? A lot of what I'm going to discuss may already be obvious to you, to the point that what I'm saying may even seem condescending to some. Again, that is not my intention. The intention is constructive, and to acknowledge that not everyone is coming to open source with the same frame or experiences. So this may or may not be useful to everyone that is watching this. Let me give you a basic outline. Broadly, I want to touch on why people start doing open source, why people continue doing open source, since I think there's maybe some interesting distinctions, why people ultimately stop or quit doing open source, and then we'll get to the actionable suggestions, so basically the do's and don'ts. We'll start with why people start doing open source. This part is probably pretty obvious, so I'll go quickly. Reasons include things, an important one, to feel helpful, right? It feels good to help others, to pay it forward. A lot of us have benefited from open source work, and it makes us happy to be able to contribute back in some way. Another big one is to learn, right? So I would say that there is a very particular set of worthwhile skills that you can train by designing and writing and maintaining publicly used tools, right? Skills that are very different to insular code. So it's the kind of stuff that you're doing when you're working with your own project or your own team. And you don't, it's tough to exercise these kinds of skills a lot of the time in a lot of corporate settings. So anyway, this is one of the motivations I think that draws people to open source. Or it can happen, for example, that you just don't normally get a chance to work with a particular language or a framework or something, and this is often a good excuse too. Another one is for stuff like a CV, or for credibility, social proof, some sort of community respect, right? I'll note, I think it's important to acknowledge that motivations don't all need to be altruistic. Actually, some of the most robust and sustainable motivations are self-interested, and that's totally okay. We can work with that. And it often happens that you anyway need to solve the problem, right? So there's a common reason to come to open source. You believe, maybe often incorrectly, that it wouldn't be much extra work to make your solution, to publish it publicly. Or maybe you want to benefit from community expertise or assistance for something you're already working on. Etc. Right? So this isn't exhaustive, just some of the common reasons. So why do people continue with open source? Writing something and maintaining it are often quite different. And maintenance is often a lot less fun, right? It involves stuff like documentation, support, bug fixes, navigating previous decisions, debts, compatibility, etc. A lot of this stuff can be quite frustrating and quite difficult. Again, it's worthwhile. This goes to the learning thing, but I'm just noting a lot of it is not necessarily fun. So it is not uncommon for folks to release lots of open source, but avoid long-term maintenance or support, right? And that's fine too. That's not a judgment. It's just an observation. So what are the motivations here for continuing open source? Obviously, first up, all the other stuff, right? All the other reasons we've already described, those are going to be true here. Another one is funding. This is a relatively new motivation, mostly self-explanatory. This can help both with motivation and as a practical enabler, right? So funding can help free up hours that maybe otherwise would need to be spent earning to cover living expenses, that sort of thing. Another one is a feeling of obligation. So you have written some software, people are using your software. If bugs come up or requests for reasonable enhancements, etc., there is often a strong sense of being responsible for that to some extent, right? And again, a big motivation in doing open source in the first place is to help people. And so I think it's pretty common to not want to feel like you're letting people down. And I'll note that this one is a bit interesting since the fear of this, right, the sense of obligation can actually create an ongoing mental burden for creators. So it can be both a source of motivation, sort of a positive motivation, but it can also act as a drain. So it can act in let's say it's got positive and negative forces. Another one is a sense of legacy or identity. So especially for folks that have produced a lot of open source over the years, they may actually come to identify themselves with their output, right? So this isn't always necessarily the most healthy thing to do, but it is a human thing to do, right? So you start to think of yourself as a person maintaining library X. And again, there's positive and negative aspects to this, but it's just worth noting that it is a phenomenon that can happen. So why do people stop open source? Broadly, practical reasons and emotional reasons, right? The practical stuff's, I think, mostly obvious. It's things like health reasons, you've changed jobs, so maybe you don't have time anymore, or something about your family or life situation has changed, so you don't have time anymore. Or you've moved on to other tools, right? You're using a different language or a different framework, or you need to earn more, right? So, you've got less time for low or zero income generating work like open source tends to be. You get the idea. There are a lot of reasons that people give up that are purely practical. But it is actually the emotional side that I want to focus on in this talk, since being engineers, we often tend to be more comfortable with the rational or practical reasons that people might quit open source, but we maybe aren't always quite as aware of the emotional stuff. And I think that the emotional side is actually where a lot of the low-hanging fruit is that we as a community maybe have some influence on. So, in other words, being aware of the emotional factors is often actionable. And it's from the emotional lens that a lot of my suggestions today are going to come. And I'll just note, it really sucks when people abandon open source projects or even sometimes quit open source altogether. There is a lot of expertise that is lost. There is hassle that is incurred. And ultimately, there is productivity that is lost. I would go so far as to say that maintaining a healthy and sustainable open source community is a key factor in maintaining a language or framework as viable, right? You need that community to keep things moving, to keep attracting new talent, to keep attracting interest, and so on. And I would say, keep in mind that people don't always quit with fanfare, right? They don't necessarily announce, hey, I'm stepping back from community X or I'm stopping to do open source. It often happens as a kind of slow attrition, right? So a gradual decline in interest or attention. Things start to go stale on the project, issues go unaddressed, PRs go unacknowledged, which causes often, run-on effects, right? New PRs are not going to be submitted, etc. So a decline starts. And it is not even a conscious decision on behalf of the creator, the maintainers, and so on, right? The creator's feelings of guilt maybe even start to pile up, making it ironically even more difficult to return because there's now this overwhelming pile of stuff that they feel has been neglected. And so this sense of inertia can arise. So this is kind of a downward spiral that we need to try and avoid. And I think we have all had experiences of, one day noticing that someone that used to be really prolific, right, a creator or maintainer, and you suddenly realize one day they're not around anymore. You haven't heard anything from them for a while. And, that sucks when that happens. It can be heartbreaking. And again, I'll just remind, people quit for different reasons. A lot of them are practical. A lot of them we can do nothing about, right? It's outside of our hands. But I am approaching this from I guess you could say, a statistical perspective, it's like, what can we do to nudge the averages, in particular regarding avoidable or reducible emotional burnout? Last disclaimer, basically, you have partial but not total control over creator burnout. We as a community have partial but not total control, right? You are not responsible for other people's emotional state. Open source creators get something from the work that they do, even if it's just the satisfaction of helping others. And they're adults, often professionals. Ultimately, it's up to them to manage their psychology and to make decisions about how they want to spend their time and energy in life, right? So I'm not making their burnout your problem, but I am acknowledging that humans are complex and we're emotional creatures that are susceptible to one extent or another. Over time, different people have different sensitivities, but we are susceptible to one extent or another to our interactions with others. And I assert that through our behavior as open source consumers, right, we have a non-zero influence, whether we are aware of that or not, right? Especially when you think about this cumulatively over time. So I want to put this differently and just say we as a community, or I guess I'll emphasize what I said earlier on. We as a community have a partial but not total control over things like creator burnout. And again, just being aware of that influence allows us both to maximize kindness and also, in a more self-interested way, to get the most that we can out of our open source creators, right? So again, this goes to the aligned interests thing. So I want to propose a lens from which to think about this. There is a common ratio that comes up all over the place that I've spoken about before in other talks, and it is relevant here too. And that's basically this idea of benefit over cost, right? In our case, the question is, how much benefit does the creator get from continuing to participate in open source? And that is weighed against how much does it cost them to continue to participate in open source. And for our purposes here, I'm going to call this the open source sustainability ratio, right? You can think of it as creators are essentially loops asking themselves over and over again, am I going to continue doing open source? And they answer that question, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, by checking this ratio, right? They continue with their open source if this ratio is above some sort of a threshold. Benefits in this equation we can understand through the motivations we discussed earlier. So this is like feeling good, helping people, learning, career or status benefits, that sort of thing. Costs we can understand as things like time, effort, frustration, feelings of stress or overwhelm, feelings of guilt, like I mentioned before. Opportunity costs. All right, so not earning money or not spending time with your family. Right? There are major costs involved. And my focus from here is basically how or where the community can help improve this ratio. In other words, where can we maybe help to nudge so that we can increase the benefits and or reduce the costs in this equation. And this is where I think I will finally switch to practical stuff. In other words, what we can do. I'm going to try enumerate some low-hanging fruit. So suggestions. I'm going to go through these quickly. Say hello. Say thank you. If you benefit from a creator's contributions, take a minute to say so, right? Be specific, be sincere. This one thing goes a surprisingly long way to keeping open source rewarding for creators, right? Again, think about the open source, the sustainability ratio. It helps prevent burnout because you are reminding the creator that they are helping people. And again, this costs us nothing to do. This costs us nothing to do as a community. And I promise you, this can make a very big difference. Optimize for the reader. So consciously optimize your issues for the reader, the maintainers, the issue supporters, the people doing triage. Help the creators help you, right? Put effort into this. Ask yourself, how can I make this issue, this question, this request as easy to understand as possible, right? And as a rough rule of thumb, you should be spending at least as long on formulating your issue as you expect the reader is going to spend on understanding and responding, right? This is important. Make urgency and impact clear. This can be especially useful for triage. Like, is this really important? Is it not so important? Do you have some sort of a deadline? Communicate that stuff when it's relevant. It's helpful for maintainers to help organize things from their side as well. Include relevant context, right? So this is this is a long subject, but mention relevant versions. Try to make it crystal clear what it is that you are trying to achieve. Try to make it crystal clear what you want and why you want it, right? Is there a clear question or a request, right? Think about this in terms of like call to action. Is there a clear call to action? Don't make the reader infer. I have seen, surprisingly common scenarios that people will sometimes just share a block of code in a GitHub issue, or worse, pages of code without any context. And then it's entirely up to the reader to try and infer what is even the point of this issue? Are you asking if the code is correct? Are you asking if the observed behavior is intended? Are you asking why this behaves the way it is? Are you asking if there's an alternative? Are you suggesting that something's broken? Are you suggesting that something should be documented that isn't? Are you suggesting that some behavior should be changed? Again, with a lot of this kind of thing, it may be completely obvious to you when you're thinking about it and you're posting. Ask yourself, is it going to be completely obvious to the person reading this thing? And remember, they may be tired. It may be at the end of the day. They may be having their own family stress going on. Make it as easy for them as possible to understand how to help you. Make it clear what you want. If you don't at least have like clear language stating, this is what I want, you are both making it more difficult for the reader to understand, and you are also harming yourself because it makes it more difficult for the reader to actually answer your question and to do it in a productive way without maybe misunderstanding. In general, I would say try to over-explain and under-assume context, right? So there's this idea, explain like you would to a 10-year-old. And I'm not even kidding. That can help. Like, try to simplify this as much as you possibly can. I think that it is fair to say that most maintainers, triage people, support folks, authors will not mind if you over-explain. There are some trade-offs with that when it comes to like being overly verbose. I'll come to those points later on. But in general, err on the side of over-explaining, since I think that that's the common, it's a more common failure to under-explain than to over-explain. Include reference links whenever possible. So this also goes to context, right? Like if you're using libraries or dependencies, if you're using some kind of not super mainstream terminology or maybe patterns, link to them, link to the library, link to the dependencies. If you're talking about something in the documentation, link to the documentation, link to a definition of the terminology or the pattern, right? Make it easy for people, and again, it may be the maintainer, it may be somebody else reading this in future, maybe a triage person. Make it as easy as possible for them to get to the crumbs, the things that they might need, right? Relatedly, be mindful of your abstraction level. So what I mean is be mindful of the difference between an implementation level discussion and an objective level discussion, right? So this is quite an important thing. So what I mean by this is the implementation level would be something like saying, hey, I'm calling function f, I'm calling it with argument x, and I'm getting result y1, but I want to get y2, right? That's an implementation level observation or question. It's like, why am I getting y2, or how do I get y2, I'm getting y1? We're talking about a function call. An objective level description would be something like, I want to solve some specific problem for which the function f maybe looks like it might be appropriate, except that I'm running into this thing where I'm calling it with argument x and I'm getting, a return that I don't want. But the point here is the implementation level is assuming stuff, right? For example, it's assuming that using f is the best way of achieving your objective in the first place. This is a super, super, super common problem, is that folks posting issues make too many assumptions about what we should even be talking about. And I encourage folks to try and be aware of when this is happening, and try to be aware of the distinction between, we're talking about this function call versus we're talking about the problem I am trying to solve using this software. And be mindful of that distinction, right? I see this kind of issue come up often when it's someone who's dealing with an existing code base. Right? They maybe don't understand the code base. It maybe has patterns or some sort of an architecture that they themselves don't understand. So they're looking at some code. They don't know what its objectives actually originally were. And now they just want the behavior to be slightly different, right? But maybe they lack the context of why things are the way they are, why they are like this in the first place, or why. And then they kind of dump a bunch of code on a maintainer and say, hey, I want this behavior to be different. Here's, 4 pages of code. It can be very difficult to assist with that kind of thing because it requires the reader, the maintainer, triage person to first try to reverse engineer the intention. In other words, we almost always need to know what the actual underlying objective is. And if you are not stating it for us, we need to try and reverse engineer that intention from looking at your code. And if it's a lot of code, if it's a lot of documentation, we have to reverse engineer a bunch of stuff to try and infer the actual underlying objective. Yes, so basically, if the issue creator cannot boil down the code to some sort of minimal relevant excerpt or excerpts, it's often a sign that they haven't taken the time to understand the why of the code that they're submitting, and they're hoping that the reader would do that, which isn't necessarily fair. I will note, of course, this is also a difficult thing to do. Sometimes you're new to a language, you're new to framework. You might, people also have different skill levels, proficiencies for these kinds of things. If you're really struggling to understand something, if you don't know the context, that's okay too. Just call it out. Say, hey, I'm sorry to dump this 10 pages of code on you. I can't make sense of it. Someone else handed this to me. Are you maybe in a better position than me to understand what's going on here? That's fine too. Just call it out and be conscious of when you're doing that. Because I think a lot of people do it by default without even consciously intending to. Yes, relatedly, always try to give simple examples. Try to make them as simple as possible. The shorter and the simpler, the better. So ideally something that can be run. If you're using a language like Clojure, which has a REPL, ideally something that can be run at the REPL, right? Include the necessary requires calls, include the necessary aliases. Give me a block of code that I can copy and paste into an existing REPL, and boom, I'm going to see what you're talking about, right? Likewise, where relevant, try to include the output that you see on your machine. If you think that your output is wrong, you'd like it to be something else, show me the output. Show what were you expecting? What do you want it to see? What do you want to see, right? So again, this can be difficult. Like simplifying examples can be difficult. Figuring out what part of the code is relevant is difficult. Try to do it anyway. Try. You'll see it often, a pattern comes up in a lot of these suggestions, which is, again, like our interests are aligned. It is beneficial for the reviewer or the reader if you try to do this. It is also beneficial for you. It's beneficial in at least two ways. Number one, again, this is a good skill to practice, right? So you learn by doing this. And number two, again, you make it more likely that the reviewer or the reader will get back to you quickly and will be able to actually give you the kind of answer you were hoping for if they can do it quickly, right? If they can squeeze that in, a few minutes in their day without scheduling a whole set of time to sit down and grok this complicated thing you've given them. Yes. So, test assumptions. So, relatedly, this is sort of a bit of a mind frame thing, or maybe a little bit goes to phrasing. But think in terms of testing assumptions rather than making assertions, right? So the word should comes up a lot in GitHub issues, right? The function should work this way or that way. The library should do this instead of that. The return value should be whatever. And I would encourage you to think in terms of, instead of saying this function should work this way, try it in the form of a question, right? Is there a reason this function doesn't work this way, right? So it's a difference of sort of question versus assertion. The problem with the word should is that it can come across as a proclamation. And again, even if you are 100% right, even if 99 out of 100 programmers would agree that what you are asserting is accurate, that it should be a certain way, right? This function is badly designed. The signature should be something different. I would encourage you to not come out of the door with that framing in that way, since you are likely to get a worse response. And you are likely contributing more than necessary to things like cumulative burnout, right? No one wins in this kind of exchange. You get exactly the same benefits, let's say, by asking in the form of a question, hey, is there a reason you didn't do it this way? Is there a reason, it seems to me this would make sense instead of that. Asking from a gentle perspective in the form of a question allows the author, the maintainer, the triage folks, whatever, it allows them to save face, and it allows them to share the context. and you are likely to get, I would say, you are more likely to get a positive response more quickly going that route, and you are less likely to ruffle feathers. I will note when open source creators talk about sometimes the sense of entitlement that some issues can exhibit, it's often little things like this, right? That over time can drain energy and enthusiasm in aggregate. Again, keep in mind, people may be tired. It might be the end of the day. They might be hoping to spend time with their kids. There might, everyone's got stuff going on. Try to be as gentle as you can with your language. Try to be mindful of this kind of stuff, right? Try to come at it from the perspective of cooperation and gratitude is what I'm proposing. Likewise, again, mind frame thing. Try to adopt the frame that you might be wrong or you might be misunderstanding something, right? And the truth is we are often wrong. I'm often wrong. Even when I'm confident that I'm not wrong, I might be missing something, right? We all make this, it's part of doing engineering, is that it's often difficult to estimate accurately whether you really understand something or not, right? And I will make the point that even if it turns out that there is a bug or something stupid in the open source that you're using, even if that is absolutely objectively the case, again, this is one of these situations where you are likelier to get a nicer and a faster response with a gracious framing, right? So, for example, instead of this return value is a bug, ask the question, is this the expected return value? I would have expected something else. Some people are going to say that this is nuts, that this, we're treating people like children here. I really encourage you to try think of this in terms of the aggregate. And again, consider the possibility that different people have different sensitivities to these kinds of things. Ultimately, I make the argument again, it doesn't hurt to be gracious. Try to frame it as gently as you can. And keep the possibility open that you might be wrong. You might be misunderstanding something. Even if you're sure you're not, just to frame it that way makes it a lot easier to digest for the other person, right? Which again, self-interest is to your benefit. Because the nicer you can make the maintainer, the creator feel in responding to your issue, the more likely they are to do it and to do it quickly. So you benefit from this as well. Mind frame, relatedly. Think of when you're creating an issue, try to think of it as you're asking someone else for help, right? This may be a little bit of a contentious one. But I think that this mind frame is useful even if you are reporting a bug, right? Even if you are providing the fix, you are still practically asking someone to read this issue, to understand, to verify, to review, to consider the implications. You are still requesting someone else spend time and energy, right? Again, maybe you're asking them to take time away from their families. And to be clear, right, submitting bug reports is a major service, both to open source creators and to the community. This is a virtuous thing. It is brilliant when you do this. But bug reports can be stressful for maintainers, right? Sometimes they're embarrassing. Sometimes it's stressful because you think, oh gosh, what are the implications? And I'm going to need to fix this, or I need to review this, right? So there's already a little bit of a heightened, let's say, a heightened emotional state that the maintainer maybe is going through having a bug pointed out. And again, right, it doesn't change the fact that you are asking for someone's time and energy here. In an ideal world, open source creators welcome bug reporters with gratitude and respect. And bug reporters submit reports with gratitude and respect, right? We are on the same side. We want the same things. And I think that it really helps. It can help to establish that frame, right? I'm asking for help, even if I'm providing a patch, even if I'm doing a service by reporting this thing. It can help set the tone of the interaction by still thinking of it in terms, yes, even though those things are true, I'm still asking for this person's help. Acknowledge outcomes, right? Please do this. If you have asked someone for assistance, and if you have gotten a response, please try to follow up to confirm what the outcome was, right? Was the suggestion helpful? Was the question successfully answered, right? yes, this worked for me. No, this didn't work for me. I've given up and I've moved on. Whatever the case, right? Even if it wasn't successful, even if you're fed up and you're moving on and you don't want to try anymore, whatever, some sort of documentation so that the person who's been trying to help you has some kind of closure. And I would note that it's not just that it's helpful for maintainers to know this, but it's helpful for the community as well. I think we've all had that kind of experience where someone asks a question, someone responds with a potential solution. We never hear in the end from the initial submitter whether it helped or not. So now you have to go and try it yourself to see if it will also solve the problem for you, right? It would be helpful. It's helpful for everyone when we have this kind of information in the public. So please don't leave open source folks hanging. It is and can be very demoralizing, right? To spend an hour or more trying to help someone only to have them basically ghost you after you've given them a solution or potential solution. You don't even know if it's worked. I've seen cases where people have spent days of back and forth giving suggestions, and then in the end, the submitter just disappears. And again, it's unclear. Like, did the last suggestion help? Did they get frustrated? Did they get frustrated and just quit? It's not obvious, right? Have they died? We don't know. That is unfortunate, and that's something I think we should try and avoid. Interpret your data. So what I mean by that is, if you are including things like logs or screenshots or charts or even code blocks, please interpret them, right? So, for example, with code, don't just dump a bunch of stuff and then leave it to the reader to infer why you're sharing that code. Like, why is that code relevant? Why are you sharing this? This happens a lot, like in performance reports or in debug. Like, people will make a report to insinuate that there's some sort of a bug, and they'll just drop, 50 lines of logs, but they're not drawing attention to anything in particular. What can be really helpful is to call out and say, okay, this over here looks wrong because line 1 says X and then line 2 says Y, and I would have expected, Y to be greater than X, but it's not, right? If there is something interesting in the data, in the logs, in the screenshots, in the code, if there's something interesting, if it's not completely obvious, please call it out, be specific, right? Say what you think it means. You might believe that the implications are obvious, but they might not be as obvious as you think, especially to all readers. Keep in mind as well, if you're posting to a project, there might be 10 maintainers, or there might be a bunch of people who might be able to help you. And just imagine, it might be obvious to half of them, but not the other half, right? It doesn't hurt you. Take a minute, just call out what you think is obvious, call out what you think is important about this thing that you're sharing, that is unexpected, that is interesting. It helps to make sure that everyone's on the same page and that effort's not wasted. Maybe someone else notices a different pattern and they think that's what you're talking about, and then effort gets wasted. Just call it out. Just take a minute. Try to be clear, right? Try to be as clear as you can. So this is a really, really difficult thing to do. And I would argue that this is one of the fundamental skills of engineering, right? To be able to understand things clearly and to be able to express things clearly. This is a skill that is deep and wide and difficult to master. There is a huge amount of variability in people's ability to do this well. So I'm not suggesting you need to do this perfectly. What I am suggesting is that you try to do the best that you can, right? This is, in fact, an opportunity to practice, right? Again, like with a lot of these things, see this as an opportunity to practice your skills in understanding things clearly and in expressing things clearly. Try to be as clear as you can, right? This idea of how to be clear, this by itself could be a whole 2-hour talk. But let's say for now, just to keep things short, just ask yourself, like as a starting point, is this as clear as I can make my question or my code or my request or whatever, right? Be in the habit of at least assessing the level of clarity and seeing if you can do better. Yes, I want to avoid that whole topic because that's a long topic. Try to be succinct. I will note, being clear and being succinct are not identical. Right? Actually, the two are often in opposition, which some people find unintuitive, but it makes sense, right? Clarity is about focus, focusing on what matters. And focus implies judgment. You're making some sort of a judgment call to say this matters, but that doesn't. Clarity is about removing things and about hierarchy. I'm going to state this, then I'm going to state that, then I'm going to state the other thing. right? It's about subtraction. It's about discrimination. That's where clarity comes from. And I just want to state again, without making this a 2-hour talk, ultimately you want a balance. You want a balance of some sort between concision and detail, right? They are in opposition to some extent. And I think that there's an easy answer to this, to resolve this quandary, which is basically sequence, right? Sequence and structure. Lead with what you think matters most and provide detail as supplementary info. In other words, think in terms of primary and supplementary. Primary information, the primary information needs to make sense, and then the supplementary information goes deeper or goes wider, right? So again, think of it as a hierarchy and try to structure your information so that the informational hierarchy matches the presentation hierarchy. Again, you've got things like order, collapsibility, indentation. You've got things to play with to sort of make it clear that something is subordinate to something else. Ultimately, you want to always try and start with what matters most, right? The idea is, hopefully, the reader will understand what you're getting at on your first sentence, right? But if they don't, they might get it by the second sentence. And if they still don't, they'll get it in this little subparagraph over there. So maybe a helpful mnemonic way of thinking about it is almost something like a landing page, right? Imagine that the reader might bounce after the first 10 words, right? You want to sell them on the product, the value proposition in as few words as possible. Think about that in terms of the way you structure things like your GitHub issues as well. Try and get to the point. Be succinct, and then start adding details, thinking in terms of supplementary info. You're adding additional context, you're adding additional context, you're adding additional context, but you're doing it sort of in a subordinate fashion, so that the content is still easy to skim, and again, acknowledging that not everyone will need the same level of context. To some people, it might be obvious, to some people, it might not. So anyway, again, this is like a super long conversation on its own, but just be aware that these are some of the tools that you might be working with. And be aware that, again, this you want to both be able to provide details, but to do it in a way where the details are not obstructing the key ideas. And again, structure and hierarchy are the main tools that you have for that, to negotiate that conflict. I will note that clarity and succinctness are valuable in at least 4 different ways. Number one, maybe most importantly, if a question is really, really clear, it often answers itself. We've all experienced this, right? You don't know quite how to phrase the question. You sit down, you really mull it through, it takes you 2 hours. Eventually, you've got a perfect, precise way of phrasing the question. And at that point, the answer is obvious. This is a thing that happens. That's one reason. Number two, a clear question indicates conscientiousness, right? It tells the reader that you have taken the time to consider and accommodate them, which buys you appreciation. And therefore, again, from a self-interested perspective, this likely buys you priority, right? A faster reply. If I can see that someone has taken the time to really try and make a question very, very clear, I know that they've spent time on this. I know that they respect my time. I appreciate that. And I'm more likely to prioritize their issue. Keep in mind, a lot of maintainers have to act as in a context of triage, right? There's too much coming in. You can't answer everything. So you have to do some sort of a filtering on the answering, or at least the sorting on the answering. Folks will often answer sooner if it looks like you've made an effort to help them do that job. So yes, a third reason, I guess you could put this as a third reason, which is a clear question is easier to answer, which means that you're likely to get a quicker answer, and it's also easier to answer accurately, right? So you're not likely to waste time with, oh, I've misunderstood what you wanted and typed up this 2-page thing, but I can actually get at the heart of what it is that you're asking and give you a useful answer as quickly as possible. Finally, a clear question helps our sustainability ratio, right? So again, if we can reduce the frustrations that maintainers and support folks have, we can reduce the costs in that ratio, right? Less frustration, lower costs. And if we can increase the perceived efficiency with which they can help the community, remember they're motivated often by helping folks. If we can improve the efficiency with which they can help folks, we're improving both the numerator and the denominator. The numerator and the denominator. We're improving both parts of the ratio, right? We're improving good feelings and we're decreasing bad feelings. I will just note as an anecdote, speaking for myself here, I look at pretty much all issues or questions within 24 hours. And if I'm able to answer accurately within like 5 minutes of work, I almost always do that right away. So it requires me to know the answer, but it also requires me to understand what's being asked. And if I can understand what's being asked, and if I know the answer, I almost always answer right away. If I can't understand the question in a few minutes, then I have to schedule time to come back to this, to process it, to, get to the bottom of it. It may require me to ask questions just to understand what is being asked, which includes latency now as well for back and forth, which means, again, you get a slower answer because now we have to wait for me to schedule some time, for me to ask for additional context, for you to answer about the additional context. We may add days to you actually solving your problem. Yes, things not to do. Assume familiarity with some particular library or framework or terminology, etc. Again, a lot of these are going to be sort of slightly repetitive from the do section, but I think they're useful to touch on here. So if you're using a particular tool or a library or a pattern and you're not absolutely confident that absolutely everyone is going to know that thing, again, link to it, mention it, call it out, make sure it's clear. Yes, dump blobs of code, data, docs. Again, please don't just link. I have this sometimes. Someone will ask a question and they will link me to the documentation, but it's like the table of contents of a 400-page documentation about a whole framework, and it's not obvious to me what they want me to look at. So please, again, be selective. Point to something in particular. Point out what is interesting, what is relevant. Try to make the amount of content that the reader needs to digest as small as possible. Don't just link to a 20-file project or a 50-page online documentation. I've had some interesting experiences where folks provided almost no context for the question and then linked me to literally a protocol document, like a stack of protocol documentation that was literally dozens and dozens of pages long without any context of what do you want me to look at here? So please, that requires the reader then to ask, oh, what is it that you want me to pay attention to here? How is this relevant, and so on, which again slows things down for you. So you get less benefit. Please do not publicly shit on others' work. So this doesn't mean no criticism. But there is a polite way to say that you had trouble with some particular software or framework, or that even you're not a fan of its particular design trade-offs, right? There is a polite way to say that. There is a neutral way to say that. Please say it in the polite, neutral way, especially when you're talking in public, right? I think a nice rule of thumb is to always assume that the maintainer is listening or reading. This is doubly frustrating for a creator when there is misleading information in the negativity, right? So it happens, there will be negative feedback being shared in public when there is some sort of obvious misunderstanding or bad expectation, right? There's the expectation of that the library consumer is wrong. And the person maybe doing the complaining never reached out or maybe didn't read the docs, like this is directly addressed in the documentation. So I guess there's kind of 2 points I want to make here. Again, criticism totally fine, and criticism can be very constructive. We need to be open, and we need to one of the things that being an open source creator is good for is it's good practice to not let's say not taking criticism personally, and that's both what I would call justified and unjustified criticism. You need to get better at not taking those things personally, both of them. But at the same time, I think that it is useful for a community to adopt the notion that in general, criticism, fine, just try not to be a dick about it, right? And again, try to imagine that the other person, the maintainer, the person who's maybe spent years of their life, many hours away from their family, trying to help people, trying to write this thing, they're reading what you're writing. So just double check, would you be okay to say that to their face? Check with yourself, because I think often people don't really think in those terms. Just try to do it politely if you're going to criticize, and try to make sure that what you're saying is accurate. If you're not sure, maybe mention that in your criticism, right? I couldn't get such and such to work. It didn't make sense to me, something like that, rather than this is all broken, this is shit, whoever designed this should feel bad, and so on. Keep in mind that open source creators are often already aware of some of the downsides of their work and may already feel bad about those downsides, like the weaknesses in the work. It's kind of a normal thing of being a creator. As you create stuff, you get better over time, things grow organically, needs change over time, right? Code is rarely perfect, or designs or frameworks are rarely perfect forever. So there is a certain amount of displeasure that naturally arises over time, and creators are often the people who are most acutely aware of that in the first place. And again, it can happen that they end up feeling bad about that. And anyway, I just want to note, shitting on them, especially in public, I think is something that we should try to avoid, and almost never does any good over just putting things in a neutral way, right? This library wasn't for me. I tried it. I didn't like these trade-offs. That's fine, right? You're communicating what you need to communicate. Just try to keep it simple. Little one, please don't ask public questions on a private channel, right? So if your question might be generally applicable, like other people might like to see the question and answer, don't do it in a DM or email. Do it somewhere where it will be indexed and other people will see the answer. Again, it just goes to politeness, right? You're asking the creator, the maintainer, the triage person, the support person to take some time to answer your question. One of the nice things about doing it in a public channel is if they answer that question, then hopefully that's approximately the last time they'll have to answer that question. But if you're doing it in a DM or an email, 10 other people might ask the same question. So do it in a public place. That way everyone benefits. Please do not post the same issue simultaneously in multiple different places without at least cross-linking, right? So that I understand the motivation. I understand the motivation when people post in multiple different places at once, right? You're eager for a response as quickly as possible. There's maybe some urgency in your situation. But if that's the case, please at least cross-link, right? Make it clear that you've asked in several places. Cross-link them. Otherwise, you run the real risk that multiple people are going to end up independently trying to help you, which often ends up meaning needlessly duplicated efforts, right? It might be that your answer is already, your question is already answered over here, and someone else doesn't know that, so now they're answering in a completely different space, and that is not efficient for anyone. Yes, it also makes debugging harder, right? Since it could be person on this side has some context, person on that side has some context, and if they were able to coordinate and share information, maybe they could get to the bottom of things quicker. So just please, make sure you at least cross-link if you're going to do this. I will note, yes, this is especially egregious in the cases where the issues are already resolved in one of the places. And you haven't informed the other places because you haven't done the, acknowledging outcomes thing that I mentioned earlier. Like, please don't be that person. You're wasting people's time if you do that. Please do not depend on code to explain what you want. So code by itself is not an explanation. In 90% of cases, I would say it should not be necessary for the maintainer to read code to understand what it is that you're saying or what it is that you want, right? If you cannot explain in plain English clearly enough, I would argue that it's a sign that you probably have not put enough effort yet into thinking it through. I would try, we were talking earlier on about sort of primary and secondary information. I would say a good rule of thumb is to try and think of code usually by default as supplementary or secondary information, right? So think about that hierarchy. It is supplementary information. It's not primary information. There are exceptions to this, but just as a rule of thumb, like try to make sure you starting with a sentence saying what you want and it's in plain English. Helps to avoid confusion. Avoid the temptation to rant. So a bug or stupid design in some open source just wasted 6 hours of your life, right? Maybe you even got paged in the middle of the night. It sucks when this happens. But like the thing that we were talking about, shitting on creators' work in public, I promise you most open source creators already feel bad or guilty enough about when this happens without you also trying to beat them up about it. Right? It is human to want to rant. It is deeply human. But please try to keep statements about problems that you've run into neutral, right? You can say, this is causing us significant trouble in production. That is totally fine. It clearly indicates the severity and it is sufficient. avoid saying something like, we were fighting with this for hours in production last night. I pulled out my hair. Everyone was screaming. The server was on fire, right? That's extreme, but you would be surprised how often the emotional arm swings more towards the right than to the left, right? Please be mindful of this. Reflect on the fact that it is totally fine that you are feeling upset, right? I'm not saying that the emotional undercurrent is wrong. It is totally justified that you are upset. I'm just questioning the value in allowing that that heightened emotional language to get through to the issue that you're posting. I don't think that it serves any benefit. Again, think in terms of self-interest, right? Venting is unlikely to get you help faster or more help, right? But it is likely to contribute to chronic creator burnout, especially over time, right? And that doesn't help you, and that doesn't help the community, right? So if you think of this in terms of benefit cost of your action in venting, right? You get 1 minute of pleasure in venting, right? So it's a low benefit. It feels good, right? But for that 1 minute of feeling good, you now are possibly incurring a non-trivial and ongoing cost on the people who are going to be trying to help you, right? Maintainers may feel bad about this for hours or days afterwards. Again, I'm not talking for everyone here, right? People have different sensitivities to this kind of stuff. And keep in mind, even people who are relatively robust, insensitive to these kinds of things, they may be in a depleted state, right? They may be having stuff going on. They've had a bad week. They've had a bad month. They're exhausted. They're already thinking about pulling back from open source because it no longer is justifiable to their family, the amount of time that they're spending on this without earning any kind of income. You don't know what kind of place the person's in. Resist the temptation, please, to just poke them at these moments. You and everyone else is more likely to get continued maintenance and support from a maintainer that is not burnt out. So please just keep that in mind. I don't know why this is coming up again. I want to do a quick advice for open source creators. So I'll keep this brief since it's not the focus of the talk. I'll go quickly. But I think it's useful to mirror some of the things I was talking about before. Number one, beware of burnout. Just be aware of its existence. Burning out on open source happens fairly frequently. It's not an unusual thing. Even to people who think that they're not prone to this, it can happen, especially, again, when we're talking about people, I want to say chronic open source, but long-term open source, right? The little things can accumulate over time. Despite everything else discussed today, right? I was giving lots of advice about the community, about the open source consumers. Despite all of that, as an open source creator, it is ultimately your responsibility to manage your psychology, right? And that can be easier to do if you've got a supportive community, like the Clojure community, for example. And it can be tougher to do without one. But ultimately, you are the one that best knows your internal state, right? So I said earlier on, for open source consumers, you are not responsible for other people's emotional states. Sort of the mirror of this here is, don't make other people responsible for your emotional state. You are responsible. Know that enthusiasm is a scarce resource that can be depleted and must be nourished, right? Try to be aware of that, and try to be aware of what you find depleting and what you find nourishing. Like, learn what your levers are so that you can make you can sort of consciously take advantage of the nourishment and avoid the depletion, right? Build strategies around that. Consider your own sustainability ratio. Again, whether people think about it in these direct terms or not, some kind of a calculation like this is going on in people's minds, right? Is there anything in particular that helps to increase your numerator, right? So your motivations. Is there anything in particular that you can do to decrease your denominator, right? Your costs. Try to be clear on what your motivations are. Rest when you need to. Please focus on the long haul. It is okay to take breaks, and it's better to rest than to burn out. Expect criticism. Like I mentioned before, some of it will be unjustified even. Expect that. If you expect that, you'll be somewhat inoculated against it. It's okay. It's a part of doing this job. A lot of it will also be justified. And it's interesting because sometimes the justified Sometimes the unjustified hurts more because it's frustrating in a particular way, but I think it's more common to say that the justified actually hurts a lot more because it's easier to dismiss unjustified criticism. But when it's really accurate and it's incisive, that can hurt. But again, that's how you learn. That's part of the job. Expect it, and I think if you expect it, you'll be okay. Expect low quality issues. Again, some proportion of issues will always be unclear or vague or unfriendly. Some proportion of people are outright hostile. Again, it's rarely malintentioned, and most people, I think, are approximately doing their best. People might have their own stuff going on. Try to be forgiving. Try to be patient. Beware of vampires. Again, sort of related to this, don't let the very small minority of actual assholes disproportionately mess with your energy. Again, it's a statistical thing I mentioned before. Some small percentage of people are going to seem rude or unreasonable. Are they actually being rude or unreasonable? Who knows? It's difficult to be objective, but it may feel that way. And if it feels that way, it will feel draining. Even if you're convinced they're being the world's worst asshole, try to recognize that it's nothing personal. And again, they may be going through some sort of a personal stress themselves. Most people are doing their best. Little one, beware of the paradox of documentation. Just be aware that sometimes the easier or the better you make your documentation, the more support you end up needing to give. And this is because of a mediator in the middle, which is maybe not obvious, which is the easier you make the documentation, the more beginners you get. And the more beginners you get, the more help they need, right? So in this, if you were to chart, let's say, quality of documentation versus amount of support you need to provide, it is not what you might expect, which is better documentation means less support. There's some second order effects that happen there. And again, just, be aware of that. Expect maintenance and support to dominate your total lifetime effort. So this isn't always true, but it often is. Don't be surprised if this turns out to be true. Rather expect this, and maybe you'll be pleasantly surprised if it happens to not be the case. But if you're not expecting this and it surprises you, that can cause stress. Lean on other open source creators, right? This includes folks doing issue triage, answering questions, making suggestions. Open source is inherently communal, and there is a strength and stamina that you can draw just from acknowledging that you're not alone, right? I think it can be helpful to think in terms of any frustrations you encounter, right? They're probably not unique to you, right? And just knowing that other people go through the same kind of process, the same kind of frustrations, that by itself, I think, can be a helpful thing to acknowledge. Finally, it helps to remember, don't forget how amazing open source is. This whole idea is crazy, mad. And it is absolutely wonderful and inspiring that it works, right? You get to be a part of this. You get to benefit from other people's works and insight and expertise, and they get to benefit from yours. And that will never stop being cool. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. You are participating in something which is amazing. I'm going to close this out. That's my talk. I hope that there was something useful in here. I guess I will wrap up maybe by just saying personally a big thank you to the many, many people over the years that have helped support and encourage my own open source work and that have provided inspiration through the open source work that they do. Often with what seems to be boundless enthusiasm and patience, even though I know that often doesn't come without massive effort and discipline, right? So some of you make it look easy, and it's often not easy. So I feel really grateful that I've been able to benefit from the wisdom and experience and just sheer hours of sacrifice from so many people. Again, this is often, hours taken away from family, from watching your kids grow, from pursuing hobbies, right? These are human hours that are going to contribute to a communal process to pursue this crazy idea and this crazy ideal that is open source. And that is, again, it's really, really cool. So I guess I would note here as well that if you are considering trying your hand at writing some open source or contributing to a project and you haven't yet, I really would encourage you to try it. It is, again, it's a brilliant way to learn. It can be a lot of fun. And I think most importantly of all, it can be deeply rewarding. So yes, I will end there and I will thank you for listening. I hope this didn't go on too long. I don't know how long this has been going on, but I hope it hasn't been too long. And thank you and be well.